Memorial Day is a federal holiday in the United States meant to honor the brave men and women who answered our nation's call to serve and who made the ultimate sacrifice for our freedom. This day was originally called Decoration Day. It was founded by the Grand Army of the Republic, an organization of veterans in Decatur, Illinois, after the American Civil War of 1868.
When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve political bands which have connected them to another, and to assume among the powers of the earth separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind requires to declare causes which impel them to separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yet to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the rights of the people to alter or abolish it and institute a new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established shall not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experiences have shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But with a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, and it is their right. It is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future securities. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, such is now the necessity that constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Britain's a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having a direct object the establishment of absolute tyranny over the states. And to prove this, let the facts be submitted to a candid world. He has refused to assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation until his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended, he is utterly neglected to attend to them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them, formidable to tyrants only. He is called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, and for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for imposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time after such disillusions to cause others to be elected, whereby legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, and refusing others to encourage migrations hither. In raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands, he is obstructing the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for tenure of offices and the amount and payment of salaries. He's erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He is kept among us in times of peace, standing armies without our consent. He has endeavored to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and acknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial, for punishment for any murder which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade from all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of a trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses, for abolishing the free system of English laws in our neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into the colonies, for taking away our charters and abolishing our most valuable laws and altering fundamentally the forms of our government, for suspending their own legislatures, for declaring themselves invested with the power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here, but declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coast, burnt our towns, destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy, scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. He's constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or fall themselves by their hands. He's incited domestic insurrections among us and endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose no rule or warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Listen. At every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be ruler of a free people. Nor have we been wanting in attention to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of the attempts by their legislature to extend unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. And we have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity that denounces a separation, and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these United Colonies are to be free and independent states, and that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown. All political connection between them and Great Britain ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all the other acts and things which independent states may have right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Thank you, folks.
7 years ago, our fathers brought forth in this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to that unfinished work which they who have fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us here to be dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave their last full measure of devotion, and that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Abraham Lincoln, November 19th, 1863. Happy Memorial Day.
Please welcome the Cadet Color Guard and the Civil Air Patrol. The Civil Air Patrol is a congressionally chartered auxiliary to the United States Air Force. The cadet program's aspect focuses on teaching cadets aged 12 through 21 how to become leaders through drill and ceremonies, aerospace education, and emergency services training. U.S. flags carried by active duty U.S. Marines, followed by an Air National Guard veteran carrying a folded flag, sometimes referred to as a cocked flag, which will be used for the events in Gale Park. Please welcome your parade Grand Marshals, Norman Phillips, Colonel of the United States Air Force retired, a World War II and Vietnam decorated fighter pilot. He's also author of the book called An American Solo. And Sean Primerano, an Exeter resident for the last 40 years, is a World War II 101st Airborne Screaming Eagle veteran and author of the book Down to the Wire. Members of the Exeter Board of Selectmen and the Exeter Town Manager. Welcome the veteran representatives from our United States Armed Forces. Kendall Wheeler from the U.S. Army, Sandy Winter from the Marine Corps, John Del Santo from the U.S. Navy, Jason Kinberg from the Air Force, and Mike Lebeck from the United States Coast Guard. Place of Exeter is the residence for 3 United States veterans, 2 who served in the U.S. Navy and 1 in the U.S. Army. Riverwoods of Exeter, a continuing care retirement community and home for 3 United States veterans in their 80s and 90s. antique cars driving in first gear are carrying 3 veterans who live at the Rockingham County home, serving in the U.S. Army and Air Forces from World War II to Vietnam. Next approaching the bandstand is the U.S. Humvee and the 5-ton medium tactical vehicle. These vehicles are used by the U.S. Army as strategically deployable vehicles that perform general resupply, ammunition resupply, maintenance and recovery, and engineer support missions, as well as weapon system platforms for combat. Let's give a warm town of Exeter welcome to the Exeter High School Marching Band. Dedicated individuals who have been greeting returning and departing flights, carrying our military service members since 2005. They provide a warm welcome or a respectful, gracious send-off to those whose job it is to keep us all safe. The Daughters of the American Revolution was founded in 1890 and is a non-profit, non-political, volunteer women's service organization dedicated to promoting patriotism, preserving American history, and securing America's future through better education for children. Let's give a warm welcome for the Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts. Now passing by the bandstand are members of the Exeter High School varsity athletes from several Division I teams, including those representing our state runner-up football team, the state champion boys soccer team, and the state champion boys swimming and diving teams. Please welcome the dog in the motorcycle with Uncle Sam in a police jacket. Another group of patriotic individuals honoring our troops by waving flags at the end of the Pease runway as planes arrive or depart. This group is also involved in displaying their respect for the military and first responders with flag lines at civic and veteran events, such as this parade.
Oliver Chadwick of Lowell, Massachusetts, had won the Yale Cup in his senior year at the Academy and after college and law school, gave up a career to join other Americans in France in 1916 because he said he saw the conflict as a threat to democracy. He was killed when his plane was shot down in August 1917. Arthur Blumenthal of Wilmington, North Carolina, joined the French Foreign Legion in 1916, a common entry point for Americans wishing to volunteer, transferring the next year to the French Flying Corps. In June 1918, he was killed in aerial combat with 4 German planes while directing artillery fire. The airfield in Wilmington is named in his honor. Parsons, the only one of the 5 to survive the war, a colorful, even flamboyant character, had come to Exeter from Holyoke, Mass., went to college, and just before the war had flown planes for Pancho Villa in Mexico. His path to Europe in 1915 required his enrolling as an assistant veterinarian, an area of expertise about which he knew very little, on a ship carrying 2,200 horses, most of which, he said, survived his care. Fortunately for us, he would write an autobiography of his experiences and thus give us a picture of these men, their motivation, and their war. He says, "Popular belief built us into legendary characters and credited us with being an heroic race of supermen. We were far from supermen. There was no thought of heroism, and our habits and morals left plenty of latitude for reproach. We were merely very wild, but very frightened youngsters, sticking our noses into something where we had no real business. Rather than heroes," he said, "we were grousing, reckless, undisciplined, irresponsible, all a trifle screwy." Parsons' memoir dispels much of that popular belief lavished on their exploits, giving us a glimpse of the reality these men faced. He described returning from aerial combat with his plane's tail and wings full of holes as a Swiss cheese, the most scared man in all of France. He described wiring a toy life-size velvet cat with the look of almost human intelligence standing straight up on the left wing of his plane as a good luck charm, and then returning from a long and terrifying dogfight with 3 German planes, his whole tail assembly torn to shreds. He finds a German slug deeply embedded in his cat on a trajectory which, except for the cat, would have entered the left side of his brain. Later in the war, as a veteran of more dogfights, he recalled that bullets whizzing by your head have a most depressing effect. There is nothing so distressing to the peace of mind. We learned too of just how primitive the early combat aircraft were. Planes flying only 100 miles an hour or less, requiring a full hour to reach combat altitude, armed with machine guns that often jammed when needed, made of flimsy material that frequently shredded on descent, open cockpits with pilots ascending several thousand feet to sub-zero temperatures, requiring them to wear heavy woolen socks, fur-lined boots, woolen long underwear, an undershirt or 2, a jersey, a shirt, a heavy sweater, a leather coat, and a fur coverall they called a teddy bear. And despite all this, in Parsons' words, feet, twin lumps of ice, rigid and unfeeling, shooting pains throughout the entire body, eyeballs and teeth smarting and burning, icy scalp contracting till it felt as if the skull would burst through. So dangerous was aerial combat in World War I that one flyer asked to be moved back to his infantry unit, where he said he would be safe. These men would be joined by other Exonians after the U.S. declaration of war in 1917, many of whom wrote letters home, now in the Academy archives. One Exonian would also become a flyer, one Hayden Alexander, known as Sheep for his unruly mop of blonde hair. Alexander served in the very first squadron of American bombers, and in one of his letters he tells of Gardner Fisk, a photographer in a plane next to Alexander. Due to a sudden jolt and downdraft, Fisk is thrown completely out of his seat and somehow lands on the tail of his plane. Grasping the fuselage with both hands and legs, as one might hold on for dear life on a bareback horse, he gradually turns himself around and then slowly shinnied back to the front of the plane and plunged back into his seat, not to be seen again until the plane landed. Much of what Alexander wrote is hardly quite so comical, such as returning to base with 14 bullet holes in the fuselage, all within 15 inches of his head. A letter written by another Exonian, Rustin McIntosh, who served as a field surgeon, tells of an incident when he's in the middle of enemy shelling. In the shelter of a wall, I met a Marine waiting there for the shelling to stop. He pointed across the street and said, "That's a goddamn pretty rose over on that wall. I'd like to have that." I followed his arm, pointing to a large red rose on a vine that ran up the wall of a house where a shell had just struck. He had no sooner spoken than he ran across the street, picked up the rose, and ran back to shelter. A Marine wouldn't look at a rose that came from a garden in peacetime. That's all I wanted to include, an episode of 10 seconds. McIntosh suggests to put one's life at risk for the sake of one rose, to grasp at a shred of beauty in the midst of such death and devastation. That is what war does. The last of the Exonians who entered the conflict before America's entrance was Harry Butters, who had enrolled at the Academy as an upper middler, son of a wealthy San Francisco industrialist. Butters had been schooled before Exeter at Beaumont College, a boys' preparatory school in Old Windsor outside London, where his father's business interests with Cecil Rhodes placed his family in England. His attachment and loyalty to his English school chums inspired Butters to use family connections to obtain a commission in the British Royal Field Artillery and join the fighting in 1915, more than 2 years before America joined the war. His baptism under fire began immediately upon arrival in France in the Battle of Loos in the fall. We know from letters Butters sent back to his family in San Francisco that his wartime experience was, at least in one way, quite extraordinary. In a letter home written on Easter Sunday, 1916, he says this: "Some days ago I was having a stroll behind my observation post when I saw a familiar figure in shrapnel-proof helmet, followed by a younger officer walking down toward me. I spotted the star and crown of a lieutenant colonel, so I clicked my heels together and saluted, and promptly demanded his pass. He didn't have one, but he introduced himself instead. 'I'm Colonel Winston Churchill.' Point of information, Churchill had been the First Lord of the Admiralty, though he resigned after the Gallipoli disaster and asked and was granted permission to join the fighting on the Western Front, which he did for a few months in 1916. Butters' letter continues, "I'm Colonel Winston Churchill, and this is Major Sinclair, my second in command. He asked me if I had been through Loos. I acknowledged that I had. He looked keenly at me for a moment, smiling, and asked me whether I was Canadian or American. And when I answered that I had the honor of being an American citizen, he was pleased as punch, claimed kinship on behalf of himself and Major Sinclair, who, like Churchill, also had an American mother. Last night, 4 days later, I went to dine with Mr. Churchill. They had a very decent battalion headquarters in an old farm. The dinner party was undisturbed by shell fire, and altogether one of the pleasantest times I've had out here. The colonel opened a couple of bottles of very good champagne. After dinner, we drew back around the fire, and in the first whiskey, the colonel caught my eye and pronounced, "Hail Columbia." I replied, "God save the King," and the international toast being completed, we turned to that most fascinating of all subjects, the future. But this interlude, of course, could not last. Not long after, on June 9, Butters wrote home again. Nothing less than a calamity. I have got to tell you, a week ago, I got such a bad time in a shelling that it cost me my nerve. I am forced to realize that it is only the culmination of a long strain. I am to be transferred. This was, of course, a case of shell shock, a term just coming into use, which forced Butters back to England for rest. There, Churchill, having returned to England, urged him not to end his recuperation just after 1 week. Butters would hear none of it and returned almost immediately, though his time at the front would be brief. One letter from Butters in particular speaks, I suspect, for many whom we honor today. Writing home to his family in 1915, this is what Harry Butters said. "It may seem to you that for me this is quite uncalled for, that it can only mean either the supreme sacrifice for nothing, or at best some of the best years of my life wasted. But I tell you that I am not only willing to give my life for this enterprise, but that I firmly believe, if I live through it to spend a useful lifetime with you, that never will I have the opportunity to gain so much honorable advancement and to do so much for the cause of the world's progress as I am here daily. I think less of myself than I did, less of the heights of personal success that I desired to climb, and more of the service that each of us must render in payment for the right to live, and by virtue of which we can progress." On August 31st, 1916, in the Battle of the Somme, his battery suffered a direct hit, killing Butters and his entire crew. He was buried not far from there in a small cemetery in a small village with a marker that read simply, as he had instructed, "Harry Butters, an American citizen." Shortly after Butters' death, in September of that year, Winston Churchill eulogized him in a London newspaper. Here is a portion of what Churchill wrote. "The death in action of this young American is a blow to the many friends he made for himself in the British Army. I met him quite by chance in his observation post, and was charmed by his extraordinary fund of wit and gaiety. His conversation was delightful, full at once of fun and good sense, and continually lighted by original reflections and captivating Americanisms. A whole table could sit and listen to him with the utmost interest and pleasure. I venture these few lines because his coming of his own free will with no national call or obligation, a stranger from across the ocean, to fight and die in our ranks. He had it in his power to pay a tribute to our cause of exceptional value. That was Winston Churchill's tribute to one of the people we honor today. And now it is our turn to pay our own respects. And we do so by reading the names of the 63 Exonians who died 100 years ago. After that, we will hear taps, a moment of silence, and I'll conclude the program.
The Phillips Exeter Academy records here the names of her sons who fell in the Great War. John Van Schack, 1883. Ezra Fitch Jr., 1901. Florence Price, 1901. Hugh Blanchard, 1905. Roger Hitchcock, 1906. Garnet Noyes, 1906. Henry Suckley, 1906. Jack Allison, 1907. Stanton Berry, 1907. Oliver Chadwick, 1907. Michael O'Donoghue, 1907. Arthur Roberts, 1907. Charles Burns, 1908. Livingston Baker, 1909. Arthur Blumenthal, 1909. Henry Butters, 1909. John Fitzgerald, 1909. Duncan Gwinney, 1909. Ired Hidden, 1909. James Dunn Jr., 1910. Robert Durgan, 1910.
Theodore H. Scuthing, 1910. Howard Arnold, 1911. Rolf Chapman, 1911. Alexander Wilson, 1911. Kenneth Fuller, 1912. Edgar Jonason, 1912. Harry Metcalf, 1912. Thomas Dorr, 1913. C. Ralph Farnsworth, 1913. H. Norman Grebe, 1913. Henry Hollis Jr., 1913. George Kerr, 1913. Winthrop Smith, 1913. Edward Young, 1913. Charles C. Cole, 1914. Frank Hazelton, 1914. Earl M. Lawrence, 1914. Frank Arnold, 1915. Lloyd Emerson, 1915. Thomas McGuire, 1915. Leonard Grange, 1915.
Stephen Potter, 1915. Pierce Atwood, 1916. Edward Bullard, 1916. Storrs Butler, 1916. Joseph Eaton, 1916. James Shannon, 1916. Robert Thompson, 1916. Richard C. Campbell Jr., 1917. Abram Fry, 1917. Alan Hollis Jr., 1917. Sanford Potter, 1917. Spencer Slauson, 1917. Richard Truitt, 1917. Joseph Wenner, 1917. Edward Bonnell, 1918. George Bourne Jr., 1918. Morris Freeman, 1918. Richard Hewitt, 1918. Stanley Peters, 1918. Henry White, 1919. And Catherine Irwin, a school nurse who was killed in France in June 1918.
World War I inspired poets as no other war, who spoke of its horrors, tried to make sense of it, and enjoined future generations to remember and observe its consequences and its costs. Siegfried Sassoon, a soldier himself, and one of the most famous of those poets, survived the war and wrote a poem, Aftermath. In it, he asks us this: have you forgotten yet? Look up and swear by the green of the spring that you'll never forget. Have you forgotten yet? Look up and swear by the green of the spring that you'll never forget. This morning, by these words, this music, and this silence, we have answered the poet's question. Thank you for that. We're adjourned.
As you entered the Gale Park area today, you may have noticed a table at the far end, and I call your attention to its purpose. It is reserved to honor the brave men and women who answered our nation's call to serve and gave the ultimate sacrifice for our freedom. I will now explain the symbolism of the items at the Missing Man table in honoring America's killed in action, prisoners of war, and missing in action. The table is round to show our everlasting concern for our missing men and women. The tablecloth is white, symbolizing the purity of their motives when answering the call to duty. The single red rose in a vase reminds us of the life of each of the missing and their loved ones and friends who keep the fate awaiting answers. The vase is tied with a red ribbon, a symbol of our continued determination to account for our missing. A slice of lemon on the bread plate is to remind us of the bitter fate of those killed, captured, or missing in a foreign land. In honor of the 13 original colonies and our forefathers who fought this great nation, we salute you. To the men who died in the war for independence, we salute you. To those men who fell in the War of 1812 to preserve our freedom, we salute you. To the brave soldiers on both sides, the North and the South, in the Civil War, we salute you. To those who shed their blood in the name of hope and freedom in the Great War, we salute you. To the fathers and sons who died in the terrible battles of World War II, Pearl Harbor, Anzio, Midway, the Bulge, Iwo Jima, Guadalcanal, Normandy, and Berlin, we salute you. To the brave men and women of our armed forces who died in Korea, we salute you. To the brave men and women of our armed forces who died in the fields of fire in Vietnam and whose names will live forever in that hollowed wall, we salute you. To the brave men and women of our armed forces who died in Desert Storm, Operation Enduring Freedom, and Operation Iraqi Freedom, we salute you. To our Commander-in-Chief who leads our nation, we salute you. To God, our parents, and our families who we love and respect, we salute you. To the men and women of the armed forces, the arsenal of democracy and the hammer of freedom, we salute you. And lastly, to freedom, because without freedom there is no honor. Without honor, we are not Americans, and on this we vow that as long as this flag flies, we will salute you.
Around the light. as we prepare for the laying of the wreath today, would you join me once again in a time of prayer, meditation, or silence? Holy One, as we come before you on this hallowed ground, we remember those who are buried here. We remember those who have fallen in service to their country. We remember veterans. We remember their family members and loved ones. God, we give you thanks for their sacrifice. And God, we ask that you would make us people in a country that is always striving to be more and more worthy of the price that has been paid for us. God, we ask that you would strengthen us, that we would be people of service, people of respect, people of honor, and people who work for the good of all. This we each ask in our own way. Amen.
detail. Good. Leave that. Oh. Good. Arms. Order. Arms. behind these colors are the few Exeter dead from the Civil War, the few that were whose remains were repatriated. Next are two stones. On the backs of those stones are the names of the Exeter citizens who lost their lives. Lester Chase, Thomas Chatney, Elmer Powers Richard, Alan M. Tarr, Ronald Keller, Paul Cameri, Lawrence C. Bloom, John L. Hogan, all those from Vietnam and the current wars. On the back of this stone, Millard A. Blaisdell, Hector W. Bruneau, Joseph Chatney Jr., you just heard that Chatney name again, some families gave more than others, Robert S. M. Connor, Maurice Couture, Rene H. DeRosers, James Durser Jr., Joseph Hamill, Christian Hansen, Albert Horsfall, Herbert R. Moss, Reynold J. Nudd, John A. Pearson, Forrest D. Shaw, Raymond H. Tuttle, Albert H. Tuttle, Albert S. Witherill, Alfred W. Whiteman, and Cornelius A. Wilson. Sergeant Nudd was killed a few days after D-Day by friendly fire. Freedom is not free, remember them, folks, and thank you all for being here. Reverend, will we have a benediction, please?
Let us pray. And now, as we go from this place, we ask that we would take with you the memory of those for whom we have gathered today. God, may every day be a memorial day in our hearts to them. May we bless those who continue to serve. May we pray for a world in which peace reigns. And may we every day remember the honor that is due to those who would give this last measure of their devotion. This we each ask in our own way. Amen.
Amen. Thank you all for coming out in this miserable weather, particularly the Kensington firing party. The Stratham firing party has to depart in order to make a conflicting engagement in their own town. And it was very nice of Kensington to come today. Thank you, my comrades. Thank you, Reverend. Parade dismissed.
Earthly light, what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose what stripes and bright stars through the perilous flight, o'er the ramparts we watched, were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets reckless, the bombs mistaken air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. Before I want to speak to you all a little bit. As a ROTC cadet, I thoroughly love Memorial Day. Going to parades has been my thing for years, and don't forget Memorial Day, what it's all about. So thank you to all of our veterans, and yeah, have a happy Memorial Day.
Thank you. Thank you. Here you go. Here's your flag.
Who loves America?